Mind Flayers. True name Illithids. They're seemingly going to be the main antagonists of Baldur's Gate 3. This is going to be a long one, guys. Hey everybody, I am Tom and you are watching my speculation series for Baldur's Gate 3. Today is going to be a very deep dive into Mind Flayers. But before we begin, if you find yourself enjoying this video, please leave a like and consider subscribing if you aren't already. With that out of the way, let's begin. If one was to ask the average resident of Faerun what a Mind Flayer is, the likely response would be nothing more than a brain-eating monster that resides in the Underdark. They have purple skin and 4 tentacles that hang from their octopus-looking heads, but other than that, they wouldn't know much. A scholar might also know of their rather impressive psionic abilities, but this understanding, while functionally sufficient for the masses, lacks an accurate understanding of their true nature. For instance, most are unaware that the reasons the Illithids choose to make their colonies in the Underdark is because, as a race, they're in hiding, on the brink of extinction. To truly comprehend the Mind Flayers, it is necessary to understand their history, a history of the largest empire ever to exist. I have briefly gone over the planes of existence of the Forgotten Realms before, but up now is a diagram of the cosmological Great Wheel. The Illithid Empire, which at its height thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of years before the current date in Baldur's Gate, spanned every realm in the lower planes. Moving from world to world, the Illithids came in search of intelligent creatures to consume and enslave, conquering their way from realm to realm. Their reason for doing this, beyond the natural instinct to expand, was in search of new and exotic food. Mind Flayers, as stated before, eat the brains of intelligent creatures. While this is indeed required to sustain them, it is also sought after because when a brain is devoured, all of the memories and experiences of the victim is absorbed by the Illithid, and in turn, due to their collective conscience, all of the Illithid in the Empire. This insatiable appetite for knowledge is the primary factor for the Empire's advance. But how exactly did they manage to forge such an imposing nation over multiple worlds? The answer comes from their incredible psionic abilities. With them, they created equally impressive technology, like the Nautiloids. Enormous flying ships capable of space travel and on-the-spot plane shifting, moving from one place to another instantaneously. This allowed the Illithids, at least in the practical sense, to cover their influence wherever they wished. As for the inner workings of the Empire itself, Illithids have a collective conscience. It's not exactly a hive mind, each individual still has autonomous thought, although in the presence of an elder brain this autonomy is lessened somewhat, but as a whole, each Illithid is mentally linked to its brethren. This connectivity allows for greater understanding, which in turn leads to less insurrection. Which isn't to say there isn't infighting, and when it does arise, those with the populace opinion will simply kill and destroy the dissenter, making for a rather stable political system, albeit a rather violent one. So the Illithid Empire was not only enormous, but structurally sound. What then caused its collapse? As I alluded to earlier, the Empire itself was one built off slavery. The strong psionics of the Mind Flayers allowed them to subjugate entire races, turning them into thralls, mind-controlled by the impressive mental prowess of the Illithids. Not all races are so easy to keep enslaved, however. The fall of the Illithid Empire was, to simplify it greatly, the most prodigious slave revolt ever undertaken. It isn't known exactly how the Gith broke their psionic enslavement. My personal theory is that their evolution of their own psionic abilities, likely born out of generations of being mind-controlled, gave them the edge required to break their captor's power. Whatever the case for their escape, they did indeed free themselves, and once they did, they were seething. To the point that vengeful doesn't seem like strong enough a word. With this force, the Gith managed to utterly break the Illithid Empire. The leader of the uprising, Gith, the race itself was named after her, as after being enslaved for so long their original species name was just lost to time. But Gith wanted to lead her forces in a genocide of the Illithid race, to once and for all end the tyranny of the greatest despots in existence. This, however, was too far for some. A dissenter named Zerthimon warned that going down such a path would lead them to becoming no better than their enemies. This feud brought on a civil war of enormous proportions, separating the Gith into 2 separate races, for want of a better term. The Githyanki, meaning the children of Gith, and the Githzerai, meaning those who disdain Gith, or those who spurn Gith. Due to this civil unrest, it gave the remaining Illithids just enough time to organise and escape, most fleeing to the material plane and hiding, creating colonies in the deepest recesses of the Underdark. And that brings us to the current day, where the idea of a Mind Flayer is so disjointed from their past that most people on the material plane know nothing of their existence beside a mere paragraph of knowledge. Let us now move on to how the Mind Flayers live today. Contrary to at the height of their empire, Illithids today are scared and hiding. They're still actively hunted by the Githyanki as they strive for the utter annihilation of the Illithid species. As such, they're found deep in the Underdark. They form colonies typically centralized around an elder brain. The modern Illithid colony, unlike those in the ancient empire, is far more akin to a hive mind, a singular mind controlling multiple organisms. The elder brain looks pretty much like one would expect from the name. It's a huge brain that floats in a vat of viscous brine. This, on the surface, may seem docile or unthreatening. Such an assumption, however, would be a grand mistake. An elder brain has almost complete psionic control all the way out to a 5-mile range. Within that radius, the elder brain can sense the presence and intelligence of creatures around it. It can also eavesdrop on any telepathic communication within that same 5-mile radius. And once you get within 120 feet, this aberration can attack directly into its victims' minds, influencing their thoughts and either subtly or by force, attempting to force them to bend to its will. This is how an elder brain functions with regards to intruders, but for the Illithids themselves, the power is even greater. The individual mind flayers form a psychic link with the elder brain, and whenever they are within that 5-mile radius of the brain, their individuality is largely lost, acting more like the appendage that the elder brain can use to do whatever it wants. The Illithids surrender this control willingly, because the benefits of both safety and security, as well as pooling of all their knowledge together, it's just far more beneficial to them than the loss of individuality. Although risky, individual Illithids will leave the colony in search of foreign knowledge that can then be brought back and given to the colony so you can advance the knowledge of the entire colony. It's worth noting that they do generally come back. As said before, they choose this kind of semi-servitude because it's better than the alternative. There are, however, rare cases where an Illithid may leave a colony and not return. This is incredibly rare because a lone Illithid is most at risk of being found and picked off by a Githyanki hunting party. As such, they probably want the security of being with a group. However, if one were to encounter such a creature, it is more than feasible that an alliance could be formed with it, as they do see other powerful entities as equals. It is worth noting that by their nature, Illithids are generally evil. Lawfully evil, so they'll generally stick to a bargain that you struck, but evil nonetheless. And as such, it's likely that the aims and goals of those of a more heroic persuasion will certainly find the Illithids' means distasteful. It's also noteworthy that if the solitary Illithid came within 5 miles of an elder brain, they would likely be absorbed back into the colony, losing their individuality, and as such would likely sever any previous made allyships. I've gone a bit into the importance of brains to the Illithids. As stated, they require them for sustenance, and as a way to accumulate more knowledge, but I've yet to go into the most important purpose for needing access to a steady supply of grey matter, and that is the reproducing habits of the mind flayers. And fair warning, things are going to go pretty gross from this point. Illithids lay eggs, thousands of them in fact, and due to their presumably amphibious ancestry, they lay them much like a fish would, in big clusters underwater, usually in the brine pool with the elder brain, although separate chambers are sometimes constructed just so you have like a safety precaution. If the elder brain gets destroyed, you don't want all of the children to die at once, so they sometimes have separate pools, but generally it's in with the elder brain. These eggs hatch into tadpoles. A tadpole left on its own won't turn into a mind flayer, however. To create an Illithid, the tadpole is inserted into the head of a living humanoid creature. From there, the tadpole, generally over the course of about a week, consumes the brain, at which point they attach themselves to the brainstem and use the body as a puppet as it changes into a fully developed brain of a new Illithid. The body itself will change into an Illithid after the tadpole is transformed fully. This rather grotesque process is called seromorphosis, and is the only way to make a new mind flayer. This is why the original empire was so heavily based off slavery, a constant need for brains to eat and bodies to be taken over to create more Illithids. So we now know how an Illithid is formed, but how about an elder brain? Well, that is a process that comes about seemingly by chance. Occasionally, during seromorphosis, instead of an Illithid, the more powerful Illithirid is born. Such a creature looks in many ways similar to a regular Illithid. However, they are much tougher, both physically and in mental prowess, and they cannot fall under the psionic sway of the elder brain. The only phenotypical difference between an Illithirid and a regular Illithid is the face tentacles. An Illithid has 4, whereas the Illithirid has 6, and they are much longer, usually reaching down to their knees in length. When a Illithirid is born, there is often tension between itself and the elder brain. Generally, although resenting the Illithid, the Elder Brain recognizes its importance and tolerates it until inevitably the Illithid gets fed up with sharing power and takes a portion of the Illithids to start a new colony. There are some very rare colonies that are just led by Illithids. However, this is very rare, as generally, once the colony has been established, the Illithid will kill itself and have its brain extracted and placed into a brine pool. And over the course of only just a few days, the brain will engorge and transform into a new Elder Brain, increasing its psionic reach and power. I'm now going to go over the D&D game statistics for the Mind Flayer. For this section, much of this will likely be changed for Baldur's Gate 3 for balancing purposes. However, it's a good way to get the idea of what the abilities are. Just keep in mind that a lot of the numbers will very likely be scaled either up or down, just to get game balance working how they like, so just remember that when going in. A Mind Flayer isn't the most imposing creature physically, generally between 5 and 6 feet tall. This is dependent entirely on the type of humanoid that was used in Ceramorphosis. An orc, for example, will make a rather intimidating looking Illithid, whereas an elf will look rather slight by comparison. But the danger of an Illithid isn't its physical ability, rather its mental prowess. As for ability scores, they have an 11 in strength and a 12 in both dexterity and constitution. As I said, physically, not that imposing. However, they have a 17 in both wisdom and charisma, and a whopping 19 in intelligence. Each and every Mind Flayer has individually a genius level intellect, compounding that further by the collective conscience, adding experiences and knowledge from every other Illithid around them. Mind Flayers can see in complete darkness out to 120 feet, as well as communicate telepathically at the same range. They can also speak audibly, however, due to their odd mouth shape, it's very difficult for them. The process is rather disgusting. It involves putting one of their own tentacles down their throat and using it like a tongue. That's both horrible to look at and reportedly uncomfortable for the Illithid. As such, they very rarely ever communicate in this way, instead just solely communicating telepathically. Officially in the books, the Illithid can speak and understand both deep speech and undercommon. However, due to the way that they gain their memories of the victims that they eat, chances are an Illithid can understand pretty much any language that you come across because they would have eaten someone who could speak that language, and they share that language between everyone in the colony. They also have a thick mucus layer that covers their skin. It's kind of disgusting, but as long as the Mind Flayer is healthy, this mucus membrane will cover them entirely, and it gives them resistance to conventional spells. It gives them an advantage in all saving throws for spells cast against them. All Mind Flayers can also cast spells innately. This isn't, however, magic in a traditional sense. The effects of the magic is practically identical to that of wizard or a cleric, but the source of the magic is neither arcane nor divine. It is born specifically from the psionics of the Illithid. It is a force of will born from the intellect of the Mind Flayers. There is occasions where an Illithid may learn some arcane power, but if it did, it would be shunned from Illithid society. Arcane magic is seen as primitive and unrefined, whereas divine magic is seen as a sign of weakness, as you have to rely on another to gain your power. The specific nature of the Illithid's magic means that, strictly speaking, a Mind Flayer can still cast their quote-unquote spells, even when in an anti-magic field. Also, their attacks cannot be counterspelled, as the source of their magic isn't external but an internal force. Nevertheless, at will, an Illithid can cast Detect Thoughts and Levitate. Also, once per day, they can Dominate Monster and cast Plane Shift. Although, the Plane Shift is limited simply to themselves, they can plane shift themselves away. Generally to run away is when they're going to be using that. But in combat, a Mind Flayer will prefer to stay as far away from its opponent as possible. Ideally, it will dispatch any particularly dangerous foes using its thralls, not having to engage at all, moving in after its opponents are dead and either harvesting or consuming their brains. However, if a physical engagement is required by the Mind Flayer, it can fire a Mind Blast out a 60-foot cone. The foe must make a DC 15 intelligence saving throw, and on a failed save, it deals an average of 22 psychic damage and stuns each enemy for up to a minute. The creature can continue to make saves during this time. Every time it hits their turn, they can try and make a save so they're not stunned anymore. However, if one manages to get in close range with a Mind Flayer, the Mind Flayers aren't helpless. The tentacles hanging around their face are used for devouring brains, and as such, they can do some damage. Through the tentacles, they can grapple their target, doing an average of 15 psychic damage, and as with the Mind Blast, they must succeed a DC 15 intelligence save or be stunned. If they are stunned in this manner, however, the creature cannot make any additional saves, and the creature remains stunned until the Mind Flayer releases them from the grapple. And finally, possibly the most terrifying ability of the Mind Flayer, literally called Extract Brain. The Mind Flayer can attack a grappled and incapacitated creature, and it's worth noting here that if you are stunned, you are considered incapacitated. But this attack does an average of 55 damage. And if this attack makes the creature reach 0 hit points, it immediately dies as the Mind Flayer extracts and devours its brain. So now that I've sufficiently scared you with the Mind Flayer's powers, let's move on to some notable creatures that the Illithids make. They create these creatures. One of which has been confirmed for Baldur's Gate 3, and the other I highly doubt is going to be in there, but nevertheless it's an interesting monster to cover. So first off, let's start with the Intellect Devourer. We know for a fact that these guys are going to be in the game, and both as enemies, and pretty early in the game, there is an opportunity to get one of these as a follower at your camp. But what exactly is an Intellect Devourer, and why do the Illithids create them? Well, that's for what they are. Literally, they're brains. Specifically, they're usually the brains of a Mind Flayer's thralls. Using a ritual and some powerful psionics to create a simple servant that has one major role: overtake the body of a humanoid and use them as a puppet to lure others back to the Illithid colony. As for how they do this, well, it's actually rather impressive, as an Intellect Devourer, as the name might suggest, has the ability to make people stupider, literally siphoning their intelligence up until the point where they're nothing but a catatonic vegetable with an intelligence of 0. At this point, they can magically teleport themselves into the cranial cavity in place of the brain and overtake the victim's body, turning them into a walking puppet. When it does this, it gains all of the memories and skills, including spells, that were known by the victim in life, and as such, they can perfectly mimic their actions and infiltrate as a highly successful spy. And next up, we have a creature that I don't expect to see in Baldur's Gate 3, but I would certainly be interested if one does show up. I spoke earlier about the reproductive cycle of the Mind Flayers, and stated that a tadpole wouldn't turn into a Mind Flayer without first being implanted into a skull. So that begs the question, what does happen if a tadpole is just left to grow? This, in a functioning Illithid society, would never happen. It's not only a taboo, but also seen as an existential threat to the colony. As such, a tadpole that gets even to a few inches is killed and eaten by the Elder Brain. If, however, there was a scenario where the colony was wiped out, for instance, by a party of adventurers, and the tadpoles were left alive, they would grow hungry and eventually turn on each other, feeding until only one remains. By this point, it would be gargantuan, and large enough to leave the brine pool in search of more food, in search of brains to devour. This is a Neothelid. This colossal worm traverses the Underdark, attacking and devouring literally anything it comes across, whether that be a settlement of drow or a colony of Illithids. What makes this creature so terrifying to the Mind Flayers is that it has the same ability as them to identify intelligent creatures around it, specifically in a 1 mile radius. However, it itself only has an intelligence of 3. This mindless aspect to the creature means that the Elder Brain can't sense it approaching, because it's not intelligent enough to be able to sense it coming, and the colony can be caught unawares and absolutely decimated by this thing. Not only is the Neothelid immensely strong, it also has an acid breath that launches in a 60-foot cone, dealing, as you might expect, acid damage to all those caught in the blast. Additionally, its tentacles have a 15-foot range in which it will grab and attempt to swallow its victims whole. On top of that, it also has access to psionic abilities, coming from the heritage of it being a Mind Flayer. It can levitate at will, and once per day it can cast Confusion, Telekinesis, and, most frighteningly, Feeble Mind, which, for those unaware, is a spell that, if successful, will set a creature's intelligence and charisma score to 1. For 30 days. An entire month. This makes them incapable of casting spells or understanding any language or even just communicating in any meaningful way. It's a ridiculously powerful spell. It's a terrifying monster. Not only is it huge and can attack you and do a bunch of physical damage, it can also just make you completely, like, if it does this to a wizard, it's a completely useless wizard, can't do a damn thing. Once again, I'm not expecting to see this gargantuan psionic worm in Baldur's Gate 3, but I would be amazingly happy if it did show up. But with that, I think we're done. I certainly didn't go over everything there is to cover about the Illithids, but I feel like I gave a good background and rundown of how our main adversaries will work in Baldur's Gate 3. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below, and if you enjoyed this dive into the life and society of Mind Flayers, please leave the video a like and consider subscribing if you aren't already. But as always, thank you for watching, and I shall see you next time.